Leeds. And thank you all for joining us online. So we have quite a few people online now. So this is going to be a couple of presentations basically about how do we manage hedgerows for receiving multiple benefits. And we are celebrating the National Hedgerow Week this week, so we're going to shout out for that. And thank you for all our partners from HedgeLink, from the Tree Council, from University of Reading for coming here and helping us with this organizing this day. So I'm going to just explain a bit how this will work. We're going to have 3 presentations, which I will present in a minute. But we're going to ask you to either write your questions in the chat, or there is a Q&A option, or write yourself a note for the questions if you're here in the room. Then we'll have a joint Q&A session at the end of the 3 presentations. Just to say that this webinar is being recorded and it will be put online. We're not expecting any kind of fire alarm in here, so if there is anything, just get out of the of the building. Should have said that an hour ago. But otherwise, we should have 3 presentations. One from Sophia here on planning hedgerows for climate change mitigation. Then Mike will present on the close the gap and the results from that project. And Joe from CEH will be talking about improving and expanding hedgerows for biodiversity. And as I said, we hope to have at the end some discussion. I'm going to be following up from that. We'll continue the exercise that we've been doing here in the room. So we'll have more time to do that after this 1 hour of presentations. So with that, I'll give the floor to Sophia to present the first presentation.
Just check that they can see. Yes. Yeah. I checked Teams first, and then okay. So hi, thank you everyone again for being here. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about what we've been doing at Leeds with our Resilient Dairy Landscape project, in which we looked at different aspects of hedgerow planting and their effects on climate change mitigation and flood risk alleviation. So let's cover our basics. Hedgerows are lines of trees or shrubs that are found around agricultural fields. They can take all sorts of shapes and sizes around the world, but in this country, they're lines of managed shrubs, and they're a very common feature of our agricultural landscapes. They have been part of our farming system for thousands of years, but despite this, they have strongly declined since the Second World War. And it is estimated that only in England and Wales, over 1 million kilometers of hedgerows has been lost since 1945. This decline is not something that has happened overnight, and it has continued over several decades. So for example, the latest countryside survey in 2007 showed that there were around 480,000 kilometers of hedgerows in England, and that was 20% less than in 1984. So in recent years, there has been a very fast-growing interest towards the need and the potential for planting new hedges. One of the main motivations for these planting goals is the hope that hedgerows will contribute towards reaching net zero goals, and that they will support the delivery of multiple ecosystem services. So as I mentioned earlier, the current estimate of hedgerow length in England is around 480,000 kilometers. And the Climate Change Committee a few years ago has called for a 40% increase in hedgerow length throughout the UK, which has also an interim goal of a 20% increase by 2035. So if we consider only England's arable and improved grassland landscapes, this would mean planting 193,000 kilometers of hedges. And to put this into context, this is half the length of the British road system, which seems very, very long. But it's only half of the length of the hedgerow that has been lost between 1984 and 2007. Also, to put it into context, if you add up the amount of existing boundary fields of arable and improved grassland landscapes, planting 193,000 kilometers of hedges would equate to planting 11% of this length. So there is space for it, at least theoretically. This climate change committee goal would contribute also significantly towards a more ambitious goal, which was set by Natural England. We will hear more about it from Joe in the next hour, and they set a goal of planting over 300,000 kilometers of hedgerows to achieve the favorable conservation status. And DEFRA has very recently announced, after a typo hiccup, that they are planning to plant around 72,000 kilometers of hedgerows by 2050. So they have a less ambitious goal. So what would mean if we actually planted 40% more hedgerows in this country? Would it help towards reaching net zero like the Climate Change Committee expects, or not? With our project, we set off to try and understand some of these aspects. So first of all, we wanted to understand, okay, we have a planting goal, but what are we actually planting at the moment? What are the planting rates, and how are we reaching our target at the moment? And then we wanted to get a better understanding of how much carbon dioxide hedges can actually sequester, both in their biomass and in the soil beneath them, and how much carbon dioxide could thus be sequestered if we planted 40% more hedges. And then we also looked into other aspects. We looked into biodiversity, but I'm not going to talk about that today. We will hear more about it from Joe. And we looked into the potential for flood alleviation instead. So where are we with hedgerow planting goals? We looked at the planting that has been done within the environmental stewardship and the countryside stewardship, because they are the main planting schemes in the country, and the data is publicly available towards the Natural England data sets. And we see that since 2004, these agro-environment schemes have planted over 5,200 kilometers of hedges, mostly around arable and improved grassland landscapes. And we can see that there is a big spike in planting rates in very recent years, which shows a strong increase in planting efforts. Hedgerow restoration, so gapping up, is also very important. And in the past couple of years, it has added 30% to the total planting efforts. These planting rates are good and they're going up, but they're way too low still. If we take into account the latest and fastest planting rate yet, it would take us over 100 years to plant 40% more hedges. So we need to do better. So we surveyed the planting efforts, and now we can look into quantifying the carbon sequestration by hedgerows. And to do this, we went to Cumbria and we worked with 5 dairy farmers there. We selected 32 hedgerows on their farms, and we divided them into 4 age groups. There were very newly planted hedges. There were hedges that were planted around 10 years ago. And there was a group of hedges that the farmer was specifically sure that they were planted 37 years ago. And then there was a wider group of old hedges that potentially ranged from decades old to hundreds of years old. And we compared this to their adjacent improved grassland fields, which were grassland ryegrass fields with application of silurian for agricultural and synthetic fertilizer, so improved grassland. We sampled the soil down to 50 centimeter depth, and we calculate soil organic carbon stocks. And we found in the top 50 centimeters of soil, the improved grassland stored around 125 tons of carbon per hectare. And in the graph here on the left, we can see the additional carbon that was stored beneath hedgerows of increasing age. So on average, these hedgerows stored around 41 tons of carbon per hectare more than the fields, which is shown by the dotted line. But what you can really see is that as the hedgerow increases, so does the additional carbon stock, which indicates an accumulation of carbon stock over time. And then you can see that between 37-year-old hedgerows and old hedgerows, the difference is quite small, which suggests that after a few decades, the soil is reaching a new equilibrium and the accumulation of carbon slows down, which is what we would expect. Importantly, we have to notice here that the young hedgerows, which had all been planted over pre-existing hedgerow boundary lines that had been there on, mapping from the 18th century, they had a very similar stock to the field. And this is very important if we think about preserving existing hedgerows, because the carbon that is lost under hedgerows gets lost, that gets stored under hedges is lost very rapidly after the removal of these hedges. So in terms of climate change mitigation, preserving existing hedges and preserving the carbon stock that is associated to them is as crucial as planting new ones. If we look at the hedges that we've lost only between 1984 and 2007, this would equate to 3.5 megatons of carbon dioxide that has been released from the soil into the atmosphere from this loss alone. So let's get into above ground biomass. We worked again with our 5 dairy farmers who very graciously let us destructively sample some of their hedges. We selected 1 meter length of hedges of different ages. So the hedges had a known volume, and we had a hedge layer expert, Rob Hogarth in Cumbria, harvest all of this woody biomass, pass it through a wood chipper, collect the wood chips so that we could weigh and dry and calculate how much carbon was stored in these volumes of hedgerows. What came out of it is that, unsurprisingly, the older the hedge, the more carbon is stored in it. So 12-year-old hedges store over twice as much than younger hedges, and old hedges store twice as much carbon than 12-year-old ones. After that jump, so the difference between 39-year-old hedges, it had been a two-year since we had sampled the soil, that's why the age is higher. The difference between 39-year-old hedges and old hedges is smaller, and that's because at some point, if you keep the hedgerow of the same volume, that increasing woody biomass is going to decrease. But the difference is still there. So the old hedgerows still store more carbon in their biomass, and that is because of hedgerow management. In particular, hedgerow laying. So all of these hedgerows were laid, and this practice allows us to store more wood within the same volume of hedgerow, and allows us to keep sequestering carbon over time, even if at small rates. So what we did was calculate those rates. So we use the carbon stock estimates to estimate how much carbon dioxide we can sequester by planting 1 kilometer of hedgerows. And we looked then at what happens 40 years after planting, and we used our hedgerow age categories to determine that. So we calculated a carbon sequestration rate for the first 6 years of age of the hedge, and then from year 7 to year 12, and from year 13 to year 14. These numbers can be used to answer the next question, which is how much carbon dioxide can we offset by planting 40% more hedgerows? This story is a little bit more complicated, but I'm gonna tell it simply here for the sake of time. We can estimate that if we want to reach the Climate Change Committee goal of planting 193,000 kilometers of hedgerows by 2050, we would require to plant hedgerows at about 4 times as fast as we're doing now. So right now we're doing around 1,700 kilometers a year, we have to plant 7,400 kilometers of hedgerows a year. If we did this and if we reached the goal by 2050 and we looked 40 years in the future from now, at that point we would have stored 7.9 megatons of CO2 in the soil organic carbon beneath the hedgerows and in their above ground biomass. And if we consider that hedgerows, that agricultural emissions are around 5.6 megatons of CO2 per year, this would mean that over the course of these 40 years, we will have offset 3.5% of those annual agricultural emissions. So very briefly, I want to give you an overview of the flood mitigation work that we have been doing. So we have been looking at hydraulic conductivity, which is a measure of how easily water is transmitted within a saturated soil, so a soil that's saturated of water. And the idea is that the land use change from improved grassland to hedgerow will change the bulk density of the soil, will increase the soil organic matter, and will make it looser. And this will favor the infiltration of water after rainfall, reducing the risk of runoff and of floods. So our results show that the potential for hedgerows to reduce flooding really depends on where the hedgerows have been planted in the first place. So on the right, we have a naturally draining soil, a brown earth, and we can see that the 4 bars that represent the hedgerows are much higher than the field in brown, meaning that the soil under these hedgerows drains faster than the fields. And instead, on the right, we have a poorly drained soil, a surface clay, and in that case, the hedgerows and the fields are quite similar, meaning that there's not much impact on this type of soils. So the pre-existing conditions of the soil are absolutely key in determining whether a hedgerow can contribute to alleviate floodings. Wrap it up quickly. We found that soil under hedgerows does store more carbon than intensive grasslands, and that this increases over time. We found that the highest potential for carbon sequestration when planting hedgerows is really in the first 12 years after planting, and then once a hedgerow reaches a set volume, it stabilizes and it stays at equilibrium. And we found that planting hedgerows is indeed a tool for atmospheric carbon sequestration, and it can contribute to flood alleviation, but that really depends on where you plant the hedgerows in the first place. But we need to increase planting. Planting rates are not there, and we will not reach these goals and offsetting goals in time if we don't. So thank you. And yeah, there's more information, and you can follow people on Twitter.
Thank you, Sophia. Yeah, I think it will be on.
It will be recorded.
I mean, it's all recorded, so I don't see a reason why not. Yeah. So I'm gonna move to Mike.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, we hear you.
Great.
Yeah. Do you have?
I'll try sharing screen. If you could let me know if it's my PowerPoint presentation comes up, please.
Working on it.
Yeah.
Can you switch to full screen? Finish. Why is it not?
This should be okay, though.
Okay, this should be fine. Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me to present today. I want to share some slides on some of the research we've been doing at the University of Reading on hedgerows, with a particular focus, I guess, on the Close the Gap project in which we were a partner. But first off, I'm an agroecologist, and I tend to study functional biodiversity in agroecosystems, particularly biodiversity that has a role to play in supporting sustainable crop production, like pollinators of crops or natural enemies of crop pests. And on the slide, you can see an aerial photo of a kind of typical intensive arable farming landscape in the UK. This is actually somewhere in Wiltshire, not far from Swindon, where I live, where we've done some work. And we're involved in a European project trying to understand the potential role of hedgerows in supporting functional biodiversity in these agroecosystems. You can see that this landscape is covered in a network of hedgerows, so potentially they can provide a really critical habitat in an otherwise heavily cropped landscape. But not all hedges are equal. So some hedges are well managed, they're diverse, they have a nice hedge bank, and they can provide important habitats for functional biodiversity, overwintering sites, additional floral resources for pollinators, for example. But other hedges may be full of gaps. They may have a kind of a reduced plant diversity associated with them. They may physically be smaller and not provide as a good habitat as perhaps other hedgerows. And so as part of this project, we wanted to explore how hedge quality affected the value of these hedgerows as a habitat for functional biodiversity, and to what extent this biodiversity perhaps spilled over into neighbouring agricultural fields, perhaps delivering important services like pest control or pollination of crops. So in this study, we worked across a number of hedgerows in the south of England, and we surveyed natural enemies and pollinators. We surveyed pollinators using transects and recording bees and hoverflies along the hedgerows, and we compared good quality hedgerows with poorer quality hedgerows. And a good quality hedgerow is one with a low percentage of gaps and a high plant diversity associated with it, and the opposite being poorer quality hedgerows. And we also surveyed natural enemies at extended points into the crop field using things like pitfall traps. We recorded the abundance of beetles and spiders, which we know are important natural enemies of crop pests. So what did we find in this study then? Well, this figure shows how the abundance of some important natural enemies, including some groups of spiders and beetles, declines as you get further away from hedgerows into crop fields. And as you can see, for some of these groups, there is a significant decline in abundance as you get further from the hedge. And this indicates that these hedgerows, by providing a kind of undisturbed area, act as a source for populations of some of this functional biodiversity to spill over into fields, and their abundance declines as you get further from those hedgerows. But we also found that hedge quality matters. For example, on those good quality hedges, we found a greater abundance of spiders, but also twice as many bees were foraging on these good quality hedgerows within these landscapes. So clearly these hedgerows provide a really important habitat for some of this functional biodiversity in these areas. But as we've heard from Sophia, hedgerows provide so much more than just a habitat for functional biodiversity. They're an important habitat for wildlife, small mammals, birds, of course. They provide important shelter for crops and livestock. Flood mitigation we've heard about as well. They help protect soil erosion and can mitigate the effects of pollution. And of course, hedgerows aren't just found in agricultural landscapes either. Here's some examples of hedgerows in urban environments, where there's a huge number of hedgerows, and their potential to deliver important ecosystem services within urban environments is really important as well. And it's within this kind of broader context of the role of hedgerows that we were working as part of the team on the Close the Gap project, looking to establish bigger, healthier and better connected hedgerows in the UK. So the Close the Gap project was led by the Tree Council. It involved a number of different partners and was funded by the UK Gov through the Green Recovery Challenge Fund. And more broadly, it had a number of aims. The aim was to, as part of this project, establish and gap up new hedges, working with different partners up and down the country, and also establish a nursery to provide the tree and seed stocks to support increased hedgerows. And it was an important part of this project was also about raising the awareness of the importance and value of hedgerows to young people, but also the general public more broadly. And National Hedgerow Week began as part of this project as well. And it's great that it's still running and that it happens to be National Hedgerow Week this week. As part of this project, Reading were kind of primarily focused on a few tasks. The first was we wanted to engage different stakeholders and try to understand what their priorities were around sort of understanding and managing hedgerows, what they considered the most important values of hedgerows were from their perspective in their context, and also try and understand any opportunities and barriers they may face to understanding and managing hedgerows in the way they would like. We also collated and reviewed existing research literature on hedgerows, but also materials that were produced to provide information and training materials on hedgerows. So part of our task was to collate and review this material with a view to supporting the development of a knowledge hub, so a kind of one-stop shop where anybody could access information on hedgerows and hope to find the kind of information they're looking for, and use that as a valuable resource. So our first task, the stakeholder workshops, as I mentioned, the kind of primary aim of these workshops was to try and understand different stakeholder priorities around hedgerows and identify perhaps barriers or knowledge gaps they may face in terms of understanding and managing hedgerows, and try and understand the kind of information or training material they'd most value. And we did this by running 4 2-hour interactive workshops with over 50 attendees. And we actually worked with the stakeholders in different groups. We work with a group of stakeholders who are primarily active in rural areas and engage with hedgerows that are found in predominantly agricultural landscapes, such as farmers, land managers, agronomists. We then had a group of stakeholders who were particularly active in urban environments and had an interest in urban hedgerows. And then our third stakeholder group were enthusiasts and educators who used hedgerows as a tool to interact with the public and provide training as well. And through these workshops, we're hoping to gain a better understanding of the perspectives of these different stakeholders, understand better their kind of training needs and preferences, and use this to inform the development of the Knowledge Hub, as well as try and explore potential research gaps and opportunities to deliver research that addressed existing knowledge gaps. So the first thing we did ahead of these workshops was to create a kind of list of benefit categories that hedgerows could potentially deliver. So we worked with a wider Close the Gap team to develop this list, and it ranged everything from providing a habitat for wildlife to helping with climate change mitigation to preserving the kind of heritage and character of a landscape. All these are potential services or benefits that a hedgerow can provide, and we ask our different stakeholders to score these benefits based on what they considered were their highest priorities. And here are some of our results. This is from our rural stakeholder group, and as you can see, they regarded the value of hedgerows for wildlife and functional biodiversity as kind of their top benefits, but also shelter for crops and livestock and climate change mitigation as well were important. Less so was the accessibility of hedgerows and kind of non-farm wood products from the hedgerows. If we consider our urban group, again, we see functional biodiversity and wildlife emerging as top, but then flood alleviation was scored quite highly, and again, climate change here and pollution control, and perhaps maybe flooding and pollution are perhaps a higher priority in urban environments, maybe. Again, we find they didn't prioritise livestock, unsurprisingly, and wood products didn't score highly either. Finally, our third group of educators and enthusiasts, again, we find wildlife and biodiversity as kind of the most highly scored benefits that were discussed. And then we find quite a mix with regards to the other benefits, with soils emerging there as well, livestock shelter, climate change, again, quite high. But I think this sort of highlights there are clear similarities between these different stakeholder groups, but there are some differences based on hedgerow context and the experience of the people attending these stakeholder workshops. We also asked them to discuss and identify kind of knowledge gaps, things that they considered were gaps in their knowledge and understanding of hedgerows from their perspective. And we can identify a few patterns here. Actually, those kind of benefits that hedgerows can deliver, and particularly the extent of those different benefits, was something they wanted to know more about and weren't necessarily as aware of as they might like to be. But then, from a practical perspective, they were also interested in practically how to. They felt they lacked the knowledge of how to manage, maintain, or establish hedgerows in different contexts, along with a number of other elements that they identified through this exercise. When we asked them specifically about potential barriers to them understanding and managing hedgerows in a way they would like, again, they presented a lot of different ideas. Time constraints on doing what they want to do, cost constraints on doing what they want to do were identified. But again, we find here that there's elements of kind of knowledge, lack of knowledge, being identified as a potential barrier. So knowledge of management methods, the understanding of what to do and how to engage and manage hedgerows, education and knowledge identified. So I think this highlights there's a whole myriad of knowledge gaps and barriers here, but this identifies that perhaps something like a knowledge hub and more accessible and effective ways of kind of providing training and raising awareness would overcome some of these barriers, as far as the perspective of our different stakeholders is concerned. So the next part of the project, Close the Gap project, we're involved in was kind of a review of the academic research. So Catherine Clark, a member of the team, worked tirelessly on this part of the project. She reviewed thousands of research papers that had considered hedgerows and carried out some research on hedgerows. And actually, she's created a database of hedgerow research that she came across, and that's been kind of categorized as well based on what it focuses, the regions in which it was carried out, the research questions it asked, and that's actually available through the University of Reading Research Data Archive, publicly accessible with a DOI. So if anyone's interested in and would find that resource useful, please do go ahead and use it. But just some headline kind of messages from that review. This figure shows what the kind of primary focus of research on hedgerows has been, again, based on these kind of 12 ecosystem service or benefit categories that we've been considering over the last kind of 25 years. And as we can see, that research on wildlife and secondly biodiversity, functional biodiversity, has been the most actively researched area. Then we see soil, but there's some elements which are clearly under-researched, climate change more recently, and then those kind of aesthetic and heritage considerations of hedgerows aren't perhaps as well understood or well evidenced as they might be in terms of the amount of research that's been done. But it's encouraging to see, I mean, these are cumulative research paper numbers, but it's encouraging to see that the research and evidence is building for these other factors as well. If we think about the kind of geographical coverage of hedgerow research and where it's been carried out and published over this period, we can see that that there is hedgerow research from many different countries around the world, which is really encouraging. Predominantly, it's kind of northwest Europe, lots from the UK, and North America as well. But it's good to see it being published elsewhere, or being carried out elsewhere. But clearly, there's gaps here too in terms of kind of spatial coverage and understanding of hedgerows, but there are more important habitat feature in some parts of the world than others, so this is expected. I now want to talk briefly about the kind of third part of the project that we were involved in, and this was about sort of supporting the development of a knowledge hub, so a place that anybody could go who is interested in hedgerows to find out more about hedgerows, or actually get quite detailed information and advice and perhaps training on hedgerows. So Michelle Felton and Lisa Bromfield, as part of the Reading team, worked to gather information and training resources that are available, and they collected nearly 500 different resources and collated this together. This includes all sorts of different material, from videos, websites, leaflets, books. These are now hosted on the Hedge Hub, which is the name of this knowledge hub, and that's hosted on the HedgeLink website. And there's some videos there. If you go to the Hedge Hub, there's some videos at the start, just highlighting how great hedges are in different contexts. If you want to whet your appetite on the value of hedges before exploring the Hedge Hub itself. So I'd certainly encourage you to go and have a look at the Hedge Hub if you're interested. But what I think is particularly useful about the Hedge Hub is that it's a database, but it's searchable based on a number of important criteria, including the kind of research or the kind of area which that training material or information covers. So the knowledge area. You can also search it and filter it by resource type, depending on what you're looking for, or even the organisation or the publisher that produced it. And importantly, you can filter by audience level as well. So there's information there for children who might just be interested in finding out a bit more about hedgerows, to professionals working in hedgerows looking for specific materials to help with management decision making. So I think a really useful kind of knowledge hub there. And if anyone's interested, please do go and visit it. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd just like to acknowledge the full Reading team who worked on all elements of those projects, including Alice Morklin, Catherine Clark, Michelle Felton, Lisa Bromfield, Simon Potts and Tiana Palanuso, and of course our colleagues and other organisations involved in the Close the Gap project. And thanks a lot for the Three Council for coordinating the project, and HedgeLink for supporting that project throughout, and all those people who took part, many of whom are here now in some of those workshops as well. Thank you very much for listening, and of course I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have about this in the session at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. So we will have a session for questions and answers at the end for all of the panelists. We will get questions to Mike as well. We'll move to Joe Staley from CEH. So can you work the magic on this?
Yeah, you can just
say. Yep. Okay. All right.
Hi, can you see my slides all right?
Yes. What? We were seeing them. Just a second. What? Why didn't you do that?
because so you can go full screen there.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, John.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Guy. So yeah, I'm going to talk today a bit about hedgerows and biodiversity, and so Sophia and Mike have both sort of touched on elements of this. So first of all, hedgerows are high on the policy agenda. Sophia gave a nice summary of this, so I'm not actually going to spend too long talking about hedgerows and policy. But I think from the summary that Sophia gave, we can see that for both biodiversity and climate change reasons, there's a lot of attention being paid to hedgerows at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to focus on why hedgerows are important for biodiversity. And hedgerows are really a key semi-natural habitat in often otherwise intensive agricultural landscapes. So they provide resources, shelter and habitat both for wider biodiversity, for functional biodiversity, as we heard from Mike, but also for threatened species, for the conservation priority species. And for example, an analysis done by Rob Walton for conservation priority species showed that if we lost hedgerows, 82 conservation priority species would decline. And in addition, we know hedgerows are often the sort of connecting routes between other semi-natural habitats. We know that some mobile species use them regularly, lots of bat species and invertebrates such as moths. There may be potential for hedgerows to also support movement under climate change, though there's less evidence for that compared to the sort of the daily foraging movement. Okay, so I'm going to address three questions relating to hedgerows and biodiversity. The first is, how much hedgerow do we need for biodiversity? And we've heard that there's expansion in this policy context of hedgerows, and a bit about the sort of speed of hedgerow planting at the moment. The second question is, what type and structure of hedgerows best support biodiversity? And the third is what hedgerow management might be best to create those structures and types of hedges that will support biodiversity. And for all three of those questions, we need to think about what evidence is available, whether we can have confidence in that evidence, and what the gaps are. And just to acknowledge that some of the evidence we reviewed that I'm going to talk about was done within the Natural England project to define favourable conservation status for hedgerows, which I did with Rob Walton, who I think is on in the meeting today, and also with our colleague Lisa Norton. Okay, so to start off with how much hedgerow is optimal for biodiversity. So the estimate we have from 2007 for hedgerow extent, this is for Great Britain. We heard earlier about England, but I'm focusing here on Great Britain, was around 700,000 kilometres of woody linear features in Great Britain. And we can see from the map on the right here that the density varies quite a lot across the country, as we might expect. So in the sort of upland, more open habitats, there's less hedge, and we know down in the southwest we have a lot more wealth of hedgerow and a greater density. So if we look at those landscapes where we do have at least a little bit of a hedge, we worked out an average density of around 4 kilometres of hedge per kilometre squared across Great Britain. And this was done for a paper in Ecological Restoration and Evidence that's just been published this year. Okay, so we looked to see what studies had tried to address the question about how much hedgerow do we need for various different biodiversity taxa. And the first thing to say is that there aren't very many studies, and that they really only focus on 3 taxa. So we found a study on hedgehogs, which suggested that if the length or the density of hedgerows was doubled, that would help hedgehogs in terms of connectivity, and obviously they're a priority conservation species. Then we looked at a study which was assessing floral resources for pollinators across agricultural landscapes. And in this study, they suggested that if we had around 14 kilometres of flowering hedgerow per kilometre square, that would be a good amount of hedge to provide pollen and nectar for 6 of key wild bee species that they'd picked out as being important functionally. And then the other 3 studies were all to do with birds, not surprisingly. There's a lot of research on birds. And they showed slightly varied results. They used slightly different methods. So the first study suggested that bird species richness was maximised between about 8 and 12 kilometres of hedge per kilometre square. The second one suggested that species richness actually was maximised quite a bit lower, but that it then stayed constant, so it didn't drop off. And then the last study was looking at grassland bird species, and showed that when you get much more than about 9.5 kilometres of hedge, you actually start to divide up your grassland patches into 2 small areas to support bird specialists. So that's a potential disbenefit of having more hedges. So taken together, those 5 studies suggest that for pollinators, for these wild bees, for hedgehogs, and for the bird species that were looked at, that there would be a benefit in increasing average hedgerow extent from what we currently have across Great Britain of just over 4 kilometres up to somewhere between 8 and 13 kilometres. But at the top end of that range, there's potential for some negative consequences. So from those studies, we recommended increasing the average extent to around 10 kilometres per kilometre square. But I would say the caveat is that we have relatively few studies, so that's based on the 5 studies that we found when we were doing the favourable conservation status definition. And yeah, so they all kind of showed a benefit for increasing hedges, but that's fairly moderate evidence, really. Okay, so moving on to the next question about what type and structures of hedgerow might best benefit biodiversity. So luckily there are more studies on this question, and the table I've got up here comes from a paper that a PhD student of mine published. So she did a literature review looking at 64 papers where different components of hedgerow structure had been related to different taxa. Thank you, Rob, for that addition in the chat. We can maybe come back to Ireland at the end. That's a good discussion point. We're just focusing on Lindsay's study for the moment. So looking across all these 64 papers, Lindsay found strong evidence that structural condition of hedgerows is important across multiple taxa, so across plants, birds, invertebrates. She separated out Lepidoptera because they were looked at separately in a lot of papers, and also mammals and birds and bats. And generally across a lot of the taxa, species were benefited by wider, larger and more dense hedgerows, with some caveats that some specialist bird species, for example, may prefer shorter hedges. Okay, and just to pick one example from a study that's been published since Lindsay did that sort of review. So last year this meta-analysis was published by Catherine Litzer and colleagues, and they took data sets on hedgerow plants from across 5 different European countries, and they found that hedgerow width was very important in terms of determining the amount and abundance of woodland specialist species that are growing in hedgerows. And they suggest that this may be due to wider hedges being able to buffer against climatic extremes and having a more beneficial microclimate. So here, this is quite a big analysis using lots of data sets from across these five countries, and it's quite useful sometimes to have those kind of comparisons across studies. Okay, so we know a bit about the type and structure of hedges that may best support biodiversity. We know from the review and from other papers since that taller and wider hedges are probably generally beneficial, and also denser hedges. But in 2007, the last national survey we had, less than half our hedges were found to be in good structural condition for height, width and gappiness. So that survey is currently being repeated this year, and within the next year we should have an up-to-date figure on national hedgerow condition. So hedgerow structure is obviously quite largely determined by hedgerow management, and there are lots of different types of hedgerow management, but they broadly fall into sort of 2 categories. One is the sort of regular hedgerow cutting, which the majority of agricultural hedgerows undergo. So that's usually cutting with a tractor-mounted flail on some sort of cycle hopefully not every year, but maybe every 2 or 3 years. And then the other type of management is restoration or rejuvenation, when a hedgerow has got quite tall and large and maybe a little bit gappy, and is restored to increase the density at the base. Traditionally, this might have been through hedge laying, but also through coppicing, and gappy hedges are also sort of planted and gapped up now. So we had a large DEFRA funded project looking at hedgerow management, and I will just give a couple of sort of little bits from this because it was quite a big project, and I know we're short of time. So we applied cutting treatment cycles to hedges at 5 different sites, looking at the timing, the frequency, but also the intensity of hedgerow cutting. So we wanted to bring in this idea that rather than cutting hedges back to the same height and width every year, farmers could potentially allow them to be a little bit taller and wider each year, and that would leave on some leaves and some berries in the autumn, which might be beneficial. So we looked at how these different cutting treatments affected floral and berry resources, so that the flowers for the pollinating insects in the spring, and then the berry resources for birds, small mammals, and also some invertebrates over winter. And we found that cutting hedges once every 3 years, or this idea of cutting to allow incremental growth, increased both of those. At the time that we did this research, there was an agri-environment scheme management option to cut hedges once every 2 years in autumn. And when we looked at that, we found that it wasn't really any better than cutting hedges every year in terms of the resources that were provided. And then, as well as looking at resources, we looked at certain aspects of the sort of biodiversity community. So I had a master's student who looked at the plant communities growing underneath the hedge, and he found that if hedges were cut for this incremental growth, there was slightly less lower species richness if they were cut in autumn, but no difference if they were cut in late winter. And then we also looked at the moth and butterfly communities, and we found that cutting in late winter was beneficial for the wider Lepidoptera community. But when we looked specifically at one conservation priority species, brown hairstreak, at a site in Devon, that late winter cutting resulted in fewer eggs for the brown hairstreak butterflies. So in both those cases, cutting for incremental growth was beneficial, both for wider Lepidoptera community and for the brown hairstreak butterflies. So this really shows that we can make some general recommendations about management to support wider and taller hedges and more dense hedges, but we really do need management to be tailored to the local conditions and to knowing which conservation priority species are present. And we also need some varying management so that we can get sort of a variety of different hedgerow structures across a network. So maybe it's time to stop thinking about managing individual hedges and start thinking about managing networks of hedgerows across landscapes. Okay, and then just to finish up, so as part of the hedgerow favourable conservation status, we also looked at what gaps there currently are in the evidence around hedgerows and biodiversity. And the gaps that we identified were estimates of the current quality or condition of hedges. So that's being filled by the survey that's going on this year. There's a gap in terms of, for all these new hedges that are being planted, understanding which landscape they may best be planted to benefit biodiversity. So the project that Mike talked about earlier that he and colleagues at Reading University did answered that question for pollinating insects, but we don't really know the answer for lots of other wildlife taxa. So it may be that hedges are best put in very intensive agricultural landscapes where there isn't other semi-natural habitat, or it may be that for some taxa they'd be more beneficial linking existing semi-natural habitat in sort of intermediate landscapes which are not the most intensive. The other gap that I mentioned earlier is we know species move along hedges in terms of day-to-day foraging, but we don't really know, or we kind of hope that hedges can play a role in connectivity under future climate change. But there's actually relatively limited evidence for that. So we don't have a lot of evidence of whole populations sort of using a hedgerow network, for example, to move north as the climate gets warmer. And the other question is, I mentioned potential disbenefits in terms of grass and bird species, but there are other possible disbenefits of including hedgerows. So, for example, spreading invasive species or diseases, and we really need some more research on that. So yeah, just to acknowledge some funding for the two projects I've mentioned, and that's it, because I think we're going to move on to discussion. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Zoe. Okay. We are running a little bit late. I'll try to get some questions there. So maybe we'll start if there is any questions here in the room to any of the speakers. Oh.
I can ask a question.
Yep.
Joe, Joe, can you hear me?
Joe, you are muted.
only just. Yeah, but yeah, just about. You, Guy might have to repeat it, I think.
Okay,
It's Mark Burst from Natural England. Fascinating presentation, thank you. The last point around species movement. So have you also got, just to turn Northern on its head, perverse as it may sound, have you also got any situations whereby you might hedges are going to serve as those pathway for species whereby that might be undesirable? In particular, you get a lot of isolated ponds where we get quite a lot of red datable species, invertebrates particularly, and hedgerows can serve as very effective pathways for newts. Great for us to do otherwise to move between two isolated ponds and sometimes strip out some of that more specialised invertebrate community. So that's a very niche example, but it just to illustrate the point sort of thing. It's not, we sometimes need to know what's there, what's special before we put that connection into play.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I think that the local situation needs to be understood both in relation to management and to hedgerow expansion, really. So that's a bit like the example of the brown hair streak butterfly that I gave, where actually for that species, cutting in autumn was better in terms of reducing egg mortality. So I would agree with that, and I think in the rush to get hedgerows planted, and there is a lot of impetus behind that, I think we need to make sure that those kind of checks and balances are there, and then not going into places where they might disbenefit sort of specialist biodiversity. I missed the first part of what you said, so sorry if there's another question. I don't know if Guy, if you can repeat that, or
No, that was it in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So we have some questions here about, or comments about how we should look at a herbaceous understory underneath the hedge, and not just on the hedge itself. I guess this is a suggestion that maybe we should promote putting a suitable seed mix to improve the hedge base flora diversity. Again, Joe, I don't know if you want to address this as biodiversity related.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think that the sort of basal flora under the hedge is really important. And it's important for in terms of the plant community itself, but also for supporting pollinators and as Lepidoptera host plants. I don't know of any seed mixes that have sort of been developed, because obviously the conditions are a bit different to the sort of seed mixes that you might put out in an open sort of field margin or something like that. So it would be interesting to know if anyone in the room sort of knows of hedgerow specific herbaceous seed mixes. I think that's an interesting idea. There was some work done quite a few years ago now, looking at the basal flora data from the 2007 countryside flora, and it was sort of grouped into I think 7 functional groups that had different restoration requirements and different management requirements, and that kind of work might be a basis for setting out and thinking about what we do in terms of the hedgerow flora. But I agree, it shouldn't be ignored.
People?
Well, linked a bit to that, I don't know, Joe, we were out in the field today, and we see a lot of these hedgerows have stingel nettles, a very nitrogen rich species, and how do we cope with that, or how do we go from a very nitrogen phosphorus rich area, and obviously the plants that go with that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a challenge, isn't it? Because depending on where the hedgerow is, in some cases they're sort of planted as a buffer to sort of absorb some of that runoff of fertilizer and other agrochemicals. So in that situation, it would always be hard to establish a plant mix that requires sort of less nutrient rich conditions. So maybe it's a question of sort of focusing hedgerow floral restoration or planting in areas where it's more likely to thrive. Yeah, I think that's a difficult one on intensive farms that are applying a lot of sort of conventional fertilizer, I suspect that the nettles and those species will always sort of win out on underneath the hedges.
Thank you. If you mind, Joe, I have a question here that I want to address to Mike. Mike, there was a question from David Williams. I mean, basically asking why farmers, do farmers just love hedges? Well, is there any reason why farmers say that they don't like hedges? So what are the downsides of hedges? So, when we were in the field today, obviously we talked about basically the fact that, hedges, take up some space. So, if you are, it will be hard to convince arable farmers to divide large fields and lose a lot of area of cash crops, for example. But from the work that you've done and the surveys you've run to close the gap, has any disbenefits been mentioned or any issues with hedges were mentioned?
Yeah, certainly. It's not all good with hedgerows, and it's all context dependent as well there. Taking land out of production, which is the reason the hedgerows have been removed in the first place, I guess, machinery access and more land to actually cultivate on. So that's a kind of clear potential disadvantage with hedgerows, I suppose. But there are others, a source of pests and diseases which might impact the crop as well. And we talked a lot about this ahead of our stakeholder workshops, because we talked about some of these potential disservices, and in the end we decided to kind of focus on the positives and try and pick apart what different stakeholders really prioritised and thought were good about hedges. But associated with each of those exercises, we had a set of discussions where we could kind of unpack that, and disservices and kind of constraints were definitely raised in all of those stakeholder workshops, and that data's all captured. The workshops were recorded. So yeah, that is an important consideration. And almost more than that, it's about, hedgerows can deliver many different things, and that the way the hedge is managed, the structure of that hedgerow and where that hedgerow is a strong determinant of the extent of which it could deliver these different benefits. And you can't deliver everything with one hedgerow. So it's about understanding these trade-offs. I think that's a really, really important exercise to do. So how you kind of, I suppose, optimize to deliver multiple benefits or focus on delivering key benefits and establishing, managing hedgerows to do that. But there are kind of limitations and disadvantages with hedgerows which were raised a number of times, certainly.
Thank you, Mike. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for some great presentations there. This morning we were discussing the management of hedges in terms of the trimming of the hedges, the incremental trimming and the benefits to be had from that, and then how to get the message across to the contractors to do that in a sympathetic way. I'm just wondering if either of you, through your work, have found ways of bridging that gap of more appropriate management to get more benefits on a broader scale.
So on the DEFRA hedgerow project, where we looked at this sort of experimentally, we did work with 6 different contractors to implement that type of management, and obviously it's a slightly different situation because it's a sort of experimental situation, and it was shortish sections of hedge, but they were on commercial farms, and we found that they were quite initially sort of were not very sold on the idea, but after we talked to them, they sort of rose to the challenge and saw it as a challenge to their cutting skills to be able to sort of cut a bit but not right back to the flail. Probably didn't help that the first year we turned up with rulers to look like we were measuring their 10 centimeters precisely, so I wouldn't recommend that approach. But yeah, I think more widely that there is a sort of idea that, or there certainly used to be an idea that hedgerows should be neat, and that if a farmer's hedges weren't neat, maybe their neighbours would sort of look down on that. But I get the impression that idea is really dwindling. So I think it's a combination of sort of communicating the benefits to farmers who are obviously paying the contractors, but also trying to engage contractors when people are out and about. Mike, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, this was touched on in the discussions, and I think it's almost what's relevant here as well is that cost and time constraint to some extent. And I think when contractors are available to do the hedgerows and how complex you can make the hedge management and perhaps varying cutting between hedgerows and things like that. So I think that time and cost constraint is a factor. Whether that's the primary reason, I don't know, but it was mentioned when we discussed this with farmers and agronomists and land managers.
Our farmers today actually talked about, obviously on many of these boundaries, two farmers own the hedge, one each side, yeah? And they might have very different views of how they manage that hedgerow, and that's what we saw today. We heard from the organic farmer that he wanted his hedges higher, but the neighbour really didn't want them that high, and it's like a battle. And obviously that's happening on all these hedgerows that are jointly shared around different environments. Interesting point.
Just on that point, I mean, anecdotally, especially when we go to places where there's Devon banked hedges, we get anecdotes from farmers saying that it's much cheaper for them to, obviously they're advocates of doing things traditionally, but they say that it's cheaper for them to lay it every 15, 20, 25 years than it is to pay to get a contractor in to mow them once a year or once every 3 years. Sort of. Have you got any evidence around that, which can shine a light on that for policymakers?
I'm not aware of a kind of cost benefit analysis on that, but you know, there's another comment in the chat talking about that land out of production being an important cost factor that needs to be considered as well. And of course that cost of managing those hedgerows is part of that equation. But it's encouraging to hear, and I guess it makes sense that if you're interacting less frequently with the hedgerow and not cutting it every year, then potentially costs could be reduced from managing that hedgerow, whilst also delivering other benefits as well by not heavily cutting it every year. So I'm not aware of a kind of a full cost benefit analysis, but that seems like it could be a really useful thing to do at this stage, particularly as it would inform the amount of potential subsidy, I guess, that could be justified to support certain management approaches, because in the end they may not fully pay for themselves in terms of a kind of crop recovery perspective. It's all those other goods and services that a hedgerow provides, which go beyond benefits to say the land manager or farmer being an example, you know, capturing carbon. I mean, yeah, so it's a complex cost benefit analysis, but it'd be good to do it, I think, because that helps with the decision making, doesn't it?
Thank you. I think we are already, you know, almost 15 minutes after the hour, so I think we'll close this webinar here. Just thanking again all our speakers. And thanks, Mike and Joe, for joining us online. And we'll close this. It will be online. So if anybody wants to share this, feel free. And I think we'll probably share their presentations as well, if it's okay with the two of you, Joe and Mike.